The blue light of the smartphone was the first thing Elias saw every morning, even before he could fully open his eyes or draw a conscious breath. It was a cold, artificial dawn that signaled the start of another day in the relentless machine. In his apartment high above the city, the hum of the world never truly stopped. Notifications chimed like a digital pulse, demanding his attention before he had even stretched his limbs. He lived in a state of perpetual fragmentation, his mind split between a dozen browser tabs, 100 unread emails, and the hollow echo of social media feeds. Every vibration in his pocket was a tiny jolt of cortisol, a micro-stress that kept him on the edge of a frantic, unseen precipice. His thoughts were like autumn leaves, caught in a wind tunnel, brief, swirling, and impossible to grasp. He was a modern professional, a man whose success was measured by his speed, yet he felt as though he were running on a treadmill that was slowly accelerating toward a breaking point. Even his attempts at faith were infected by this digital rot. On the rare mornings when he reached for his Bible, it wasn't out of a hunger for the divine, but out of a lingering sense of duty that felt increasingly burdensome. He would swipe through a verse of the day app with the same mindless speed he used for the morning news. He read the sacred words like they were status updates, skimming the surface, looking for a quick hit of inspiration that he could consume and forget within seconds. There was no depth, no resonance. The words felt like dry husks in his mind because he never gave them the silence required to take root. He was spiritually malnourished, attempting to survive on the thin broth of slogans while his soul craved the feast of true presence. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. This emptiness wasn't just a lack of feeling, it was a profound disorientation, as a ship with a broken compass, drifting in a sea of data without any sense of north. The inevitable collapse happened on a Tuesday. Elias was sitting in the glass-walled boardroom of his firm, the centerpiece of a high-stakes presentation that had been months in the making. As he stood to speak, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Then again, and again. Even though it was on silent, the phantom vibrations felt like a physical assault against his thigh. He lost the thread of his argument. A crucial data point vanished from his mind, replaced by the nagging, irrational worry of who was trying to reach him. He stammered, his eyes darting to his wrist as his smartwatch lit up with a notification about a trivial social media mention. The silence in the room became heavy and judgmental. He saw the disappointment in his boss's eyes and the confusion on the faces of the investors. He had failed not because he lacked the knowledge, but because he no longer possessed the power of focus. He was a man who owned everything but his own mind, and in that moment of public humiliation, the weight of his distraction finally crushed him. That night, the physical toll of his lifestyle manifested as a crushing weight on his chest. The brain fog that had been a constant companion now felt like a thick, gray veil between him and reality. His eyes burned from blue light, and a persistent tremor lived in his fingertips, a nervous tic born from years of scrolling. He was exhausted down to his marrow, yet sleep was an impossible country. His heart raced with a phantom anxiety, a fear of being left behind by a world that moved too fast for human endurance. He was connected to everyone and everything through a web of glass and silicon, yet he felt more profoundly isolated than if he had been stranded on a desert island. He was a stranger to himself, a ghost haunting his own life, trapped in a body that was perpetually on, but functionally dead. Desperate and seeking some form of distraction that wasn't digital, Elias began rummaging through an old wooden chest in the corner of his bedroom, a relic he hadn't opened in years. At the bottom, tucked between a dusty hymnal and a faded photograph, he found a yellowed scrap of paper. It was a note from his grandfather, written in a steady, elegant hand that seemed to belong to a different century, The words were few, but they hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. "Elias," the note read, "the world will drown you in its roar. But remember, there is a secret frequency that can only be found in the silence. It is the frequency where the Creator speaks. If you lose it, you lose yourself. Go to the quiet places, and the word will find you." A sudden, desperate hunger ignited in Elias's chest, a realization that he was dying of thirst in the middle of an ocean of noise. He knew he couldn't stay here anymore. The note wasn't just a memory, it was a map leading out of the chaos. Elias watched the city's grey skyline dissolve into the distance, replaced by the jagged silhouettes of rising foothills. Every mile of pavement that slid beneath his tires felt like a thread being snapped, a slow untethering from the invisible web that had held him captive for years. He had packed a single bag in haste, driven by the frantic conviction found in his grandfather's note. He left his primary phone in a locked drawer at his apartment, yet the absence of the device felt like a missing limb, a cold ache of phantom connectivity that made his hands twitch against the steering wheel. His destination was a modest, weather-beaten cabin perched on a high plateau, a place where the wind sang through ancient pines and the only light at night came from the unblinking stars. As the car climbed higher into the thin, crisp air, a strange, cold panic began to settle in his stomach. He was stepping into the void his grandfather had written about, and for the first time in his life, he was truly afraid of being alone with the silence. Upon his arrival, the stillness of the plateau was not the peaceful embrace he had imagined. Instead, it was an abrasive, terrifying presence. Elias sat on the edge of a wooden chair on the cabin's porch, his hands instinctively reaching for a pocket that was no longer occupied. He felt the phantom vibration against his thigh, a ghost of a notification that did not exist. His heart hammered in his chest, not from physical exertion, but from the sheer lack of digital input. His brain, conditioned by decades of high-speed data and flashing lights, was screaming for a hit of dopamine. He felt twitchy, irritable, and profoundly bored. Every rustle of the dry grass and every creak of the cabin walls sounded like a shout in the vacuum of the desert. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the cacophony of his own internal noise, the echoes of his boardroom failure, the staccato rhythm of unanswered emails, and the frantic list of tasks he had abandoned swirled in his mind like a persistent storm. He tried to remember the secular mindfulness techniques he had seen in various wellness apps. He sat on the floor, crossed his legs, and squeezed his eyes shut. He tried to breathe deeply and make his mind a blank slate, attempting to push the chaos away to find the nothingness promised by modern gurus. But it was like trying to hold back a flood with a wicker basket. The more he tried to create a vacuum in his mind, the more the darkness and anxiety rushed in to fill the space. He felt like he was drowning in a sea of his own unmoored thoughts. This secular void offered no comfort. It only highlighted the vast, echoing space where his soul should have been. He realized then that he was approaching this all wrong. His grandfather hadn't spoken of an empty mind, but of a mind tuned to a specific frequency. If he simply cleared the deck, the demons of his distraction would only dance louder in the open space. He wasn't supposed to empty himself. He was supposed to be filled. Desperate for an anchor, Elias reached for the leather-bound Bible he had brought with him, its weight unfamiliar and heavy in his lap. He didn't swipe or scroll. He turned physical pages, the sound of the paper crisp and rhythmic in the quiet room. He found himself at the very beginning of the Psalms. He read the words slowly, forcing his eyes to stay on each syllable as if he were learning to read for the first time. He is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season and whose leaf does not wither. He stopped. He didn't move on to the next verse. Instead, he began to visualize the tree, He closed his eyes and built the image, the deep, gnarled roots reaching into the cool, dark earth, seeking the hidden moisture of the stream. He focused on the stability of the trunk against the mountain wind and the vitality of leaves that refused to turn brown. For the first time, he wasn't consuming information. He was dwelling within a living truth. A strange, fragile sense of calm began to weave its way through the jagged edges of his mind. The frantic pulse in his neck slowed to a steady rhythm. The air in the cabin suddenly felt cooler, cleaner, as if the word itself was scrubbing the atmosphere of his thoughts. He whispered the words aloud, letting the sound of the promise hang in the air like incense. Planted by streams of water, he felt a spark of something he hadn't known in years, a flicker of genuine, unhurried peace that seemed to bypass his intellect and settle directly into his heart. The secret frequency was beginning to hum, a low, resonant note of eternity. But then, a sharp, electronic ping cut through the sacred quiet like a razor. It didn't come from his pocket. It came from his travel bag. He had forgotten his work tablet, buried deep beneath his clothes, and in his haste, he had neglected to power it down. The screen lit up inside the fabric, a malevolent blue glow bleeding through the canvas. In that instant, the peace vanished, and Elias realized with sickening clarity that the world had followed him into the desert. He was still a slave to the machine, and the battle for his soul had only just begun. The blue light pulsed from the depths of the bag like a rhythmic heartbeat. Elias stood paralyzed, his breath hitching as the silence was devoured by the insistent electronic chirp. It was a sound he had heard 1,000 times a day, a notification, a summons, a digital tether. Here, it sounded like a scream. He felt a visceral pull toward the bag, a magnetic attraction making his muscles ache with the desire to touch the screen, to see what catastrophe required him. This was the war for attention his grandfather had hinted at, a spiritual conflict fought with dopamine and flickering pixels. Elias realized that his focus was not merely a mental faculty, it was his highest form of worship. For years, he had been offering his most precious resource, his conscious presence, upon the altar of the digital world. Every mindless scroll and frantic response had been an act of devotion to an idol that gave nothing back but exhaustion. He forced himself to turn away, his heart racing. He sat on the floor, the Bible open in his lap. He needed to go deeper. He recalled a concept from his grandfather's notes, the Hebrew root Haga. Biblical meditation was never about emptying the mind. It was about the active, vocal rumination of truth. Haga meant to mutter, moan or growl. It was the sound a lion made over its prey. It was how a cow chewed its cud, processing the same thing until every ounce of nourishment was extracted. Elias began to mutter the words of the psalm, his voice a low whisper. Planted by streams of water. He wasn't just thinking the words, he was chewing on them, letting the sounds vibrate in his throat, forcing his distracted mind to grip the image of the tree with the tenacity of a predator. But the resistance was relentless. The tablet chirped again, signaling an urgent priority. The sounds triggered images of his boss's face and the mounting tasks waiting for him. Guilt gnawed at his stomach. Who was he to seek peace while his responsibilities piled up? The digital voices whispered that he was failing, that his professional life was unraveling because he chose silence over speed. The pressure of the city reached across the miles like a spectral hand. He felt profoundly inadequate. He was too far gone. His brain had been rewired by a decade of high-speed data, his neurons conditioned for shallow bursts. He felt like a broken instrument, trying to play a symphony. The silence of the desert now felt like a mirror reflecting his own hollowness. He looked at the device, then back at the text, feeling like an interloper in a sacred space he no longer had the right to occupy. The addiction was not just in his hands, it was in the very marrow of his identity. He wondered if the secret frequency was a myth for people who didn't live in the 21st century, a luxury for those with simpler minds and slower pulses. Every time he closed his eyes, he didn't see the stream or the tree. He saw red notification bubbles and unread count indicators. The mental fog was thick, a grey shroud that made even the simplest verse feel like a mountain he couldn't climb. He felt the phantom itch to check his email, to reassure himself that he was still relevant, still needed, still connected. The silence wasn't healing him. It was exposing how much of him had already been consumed by the machine. He felt a desperate urge to pack his things and drive back to the noise, to the comfort of the distraction he understood. The weight of his own failure was becoming more unbearable than the silence itself. He was a man dying of thirst, who had finally found the well, only to realize he had forgotten how to swallow. Tears of frustration pricked his eyes. He was about to give in, to reach for the tablet and surrender, when his gaze fell upon the book of Isaiah. The fading light caught a specific verse, and the words seemed to leap off the paper. It spoke of those who tried to save themselves through speed. Then the tone shifted. In returning and rest, you shall be saved. In quietness and in trust shall be your strength. The word returning struck him like a physical blow. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about the act of coming back to the source. It was a lifeline thrown into his sea of chaos, a promise that his brokenness was where the strength was meant to begin. He stared at the words, realizing that the battle wasn't about ignoring the noise, but about choosing which voice to return to when the noise became deafening. He reached out, not for the tablet, but for the page, his fingers trembling as he traced the ink of a promise that felt more real than the blue light. Elias sat on the uneven wooden floor of the cabin, the shadows stretching long and thin across the grain of the timber as the sun dipped below the horizon. The verse from Isaiah, "In returning and rest you shall be saved," was no longer just ink on a page. It had become a rhythm, a steady pulse in the quiet room. He began to practice the art of chewing the word, just as his grandfather's notes had described. He whispered the words aloud, over and over, letting each syllable linger on his tongue like a rare delicacy. In returning. He visualized a weary traveler turning his horse back toward home, abandoning the frantic, dusty road of progress for the familiar gates of a sanctuary. And rest. He felt the tension in his shoulders, a weight he had carried for a decade without realizing it, begin to loosen and dissolve. This was the Haga. It wasn't an intellectual exercise to be completed or a checkbox to be ticked. It was a slow, deliberate digestion of the soul. He wasn't trying to finish the chapter. He was trying to let the chapter finish him, breaking down his ego and his frantic need for relevance until only the truth remained. Hours passed in that holy repetition, yet the passage of time felt fundamentally different. No longer a series of seconds to be managed and exploited, but a vast, shimmering ocean in which he was finally learning how to swim. As the moon rose, casting a silver ethereal glow over the desert sand, Elias stepped onto the small porch. The world looked strikingly different. The deep purples and indigos of the night sky seemed more vibrant, more dimensional, as if a thick layer of digital dust had been wiped from his eyes. The internal static that had plagued his mind for years, the constant, discordant mental chatter of unread emails and project deadlines, began to harmonize with the low hum of the desert wind. He noticed the intricate patterns of the stars, the way they formed a silent, celestial architecture he usually ignored in favor of a glowing 5-inch screen. His focus was sharpening, but not for the sake of efficiency or professional gain. He felt a profound, aching sense of connection to the creator of those stars. He realized that for most of his life, He had treated the Bible like a technical manual to be hacked, seeking quick tips and 5 steps to a better life, rather than seeking the presence of the life itself. The peace he was discovering wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the presence of a person. The profound silence was suddenly punctured by a memory, sharp and jagged. It wasn't a physical notification this time, but a mental one. A specific project file he had left unresolved on his tablet. He knew exactly where it was in the directory. He knew that if he just opened the device for 5 minutes, he could send one precise email that would resolve a week's worth of anxiety when he eventually returned to the city. It was a tempting shortcut to peace, a way to use the world's frantic tools to secure his future so that he could focus on God better in the days to come. The temptation was subtle, logical, and entirely reasonable. He stood up, his hand hovering over the travel bag where the blue light had pulsed earlier. He could cheat just this once, balancing his spiritual retreat with a momentary dip back into his old life. The digital world whispered that he could have both, the secret frequency of the desert and the high-speed success of the city. He felt the old anxiety flare up in his chest, the phantom vibration of a phone in his pocket that wasn't even there. He was at a literal and figurative crossroads. Elias pulled his hand back as if the canvas bag were made of burning coals. He sat back down on the porch, breathing heavily as the realization hit him with the force of a mountain storm. This had never been a time management problem. It wasn't about being too busy or having too many apps or a demanding boss. It was a heart allegiance problem. He had been a distracted man because he was a divided man. He had been frantically looking for life and identity in the digital stream while claiming to follow the living water. His focus had been stolen not because technology was too powerful, but because his heart was too fickle. He had given his loyalty, his energy, and his worship to the idols of performance and human approval, and the brain fog was simply the smoke rising from the altars he had built to himself. Reclaiming his focus meant reclaiming his worship. It wasn't just his eyes that needed to change. It was his king. He looked back at the open book, realizing that the battle for his attention was actually the battle for his soul. The fragile peace Elias had built was shattered by a sound he had forgotten existed. It was the shrill, mechanical trill of a satellite phone he had tucked away for family emergencies. The noise was an invasive species in this garden of silence, a reminder that the world he had fled was still capable of reaching across the void. With trembling hands, he answered. The voice was his sister, Sarah, her words broken by sobbing. Their mother had suffered a massive stroke. The doctors used words like critical and uncertain, terms that acted like physical blows to Elias's chest. In an instant, his newfound clarity felt like a cruel joke, a thin veneer of spirituality that was now cracking under the weight of a sudden real-world catastrophe. The instinctive reaction was a violent surge of old habits. Elias felt a desperate physical hunger to be connected and in control. He scrambled for his laptop, his fingers fumbling with the latches as if his life depended on the blue light. He needed to research hospitals and drown the terrifying silence of the desert in the white noise of information. He wanted to scroll through medical forums until his eyes burned, losing himself in the frantic search for solutions that would give him an illusion of agency. The temptation to numb the agony of helplessness with digital distraction was a siren song, promising that if he just looked at enough screens, the pain would become manageable. He sat there, the screen glowing with an invitation to return to his old idols of speed. The clash between these two realities, the chaotic news and the still, small voice, created a spiritual friction that felt like fire. The digital world screamed that he was wasting time and that only data and action mattered now. But beneath that roar, a different frequency began to vibrate. It was the Haga he had been practicing, the rhythmic rumination on the character of God. He realized he was at the ultimate crossroads of his journey. He could drown in the noise, returning to the city as the same fragmented man who had left it, or he could stand on the promise he had been chewing on. The silence was no longer a comfort. It was now a battlefield where his newfound faith was being tested by the oldest of enemies: fear. Elias stood at the threshold of the cabin, car keys in one hand and laptop in the other. His heart was a drum of anxiety, and the vast desert offered no answers to his grief. The tension reached its climax as he looked at the path leading to his vehicle. He could be back in the city in hours, back in the familiar chaos, where he didn't have to face the terrifying depths of his soul. He felt his mother's condition like a crushing stone, and the urge to flee was overwhelming. But as he turned toward the car, a word from his grandfather's notes echoed. Wait. It wasn't about laziness, but a command of spiritual positioning. Reclaiming his focus meant more than just turning off a phone. It meant refusing to let the storm dictate his peace, choosing instead to anchor himself to the unchanging nature of the one who commanded the winds. In a moment of radical defiance, Elias set the laptop and keys back on the porch. He walked out into the clearing, where the sun beat down with intensity. He didn't reach for a screen. He reached for the living word. He dropped to his knees in the dirt, closed his eyes, and began to recite. He muttered the scriptures into the wind, letting the syllables of ancient promises settle into the dust. As he spoke of the God who is a refuge and help in trouble, something supernatural happened. The panic didn't vanish, but it was eclipsed by an inexplicable calm. As Elias stood in the heat, his lips moving in focused prayer, the chaotic noise of the world finally met its match in the quiet, overwhelming strength of the word. The silence was no longer an empty void. It had become a vibrant shield that stood between his heart and the arrows of fear. Elias remained on his knees, his forehead pressed against the sun-baked earth. The dirt was coarse, a grounding reality that contrasted with the ethereal, fluid calm washing over his soul. This was not the fragile, manufactured quiet he had tried to construct in his first days at the cabin. This was something weightier, a thick presence that seemed to stabilize the air he breathed. The news of his mother's stroke still hung in the back of his mind, but it no longer felt like a crushing boulder threatening to flatten his resolve. Instead, it was a weight he was being supernaturally helped to carry. He experienced, for the first time in his life, the peace that surpasses understanding. It was a fortress of the mind, a sanctuary built not of stone and mortar, but of eternal truth and focused intent. He realized the word was not merely ink on parchment. It was a living shield, a spiritual armor that could parry the sharpest arrows of panic. In this profound clarity, the labels he had worn for years began to peel away like old sun-bleached posters. For a decade, the digital world had defined him by his utility. He was a professional to be optimized, a user to be harvested, and a consumer to be targeted. His identity had been a fluctuating, fragile graph of likes, metrics, and unread emails. When his focus failed, he felt like a broken machine in a factory. But here, in the rhythmic mumble of his own voice reciting the promises of God, a deeper, unshakable identity emerged. He was not a slave to the algorithm or a casualty of the attention economy. He was a son of the Creator, an ambassador of a kingdom whose value was not tied to his response time. The labels of the digital age, his job title, his social status, his perceived failures, dissolved in the desert heat. Elias was whole. As the hours passed, the scriptures he had labored to chew on became his most potent weapons. When the fear of mortality crept in, he met it with the unwavering truth of the resurrection. When the anxiety of his neglected career whispered of impending ruin, He countered with the promise of the God who clothes the lilies of the field. Each verse was no longer a passive memory, but a tactical response. He was no longer just reading the Bible, he was breathing it. The mental fog was gone, replaced by a razor-sharp focus that saw through the illusions of the frantic world. He saw the war for attention for what it truly was, a battle for where his heart found its ultimate home. Every distraction was a skirmish, and every memorized truth was a victory that secured his internal borders. With this newfound strength, Elias felt a sudden conviction about the wreckage he had left behind in the city. He thought of Julian, the colleague he had betrayed during his most chaotic month, the man whose reputation Elias had subtly undermined to mask his failures. The memory didn't come with the old, paralyzing shame, but with a clear mandate for restoration. He reached for the satellite phone. His hands didn't tremble. He called Julian. The conversation was brief, but heavy with the gravity of a transformed heart. Elias didn't offer excuses or blame the pressure of the office. He offered a sincere, humble apology and a promise of restitution. It was the first fruit of a heart no longer divided. The focused man was a man who could finally take responsibility. As the sun dipped behind the jagged hills, casting long purple shadows across the floor, Elias began to pack. He folded his clothes with a deliberate, slow grace, a contrast to the frantic packing that brought him here. He looked at the laptop and the smartphones, the icons of his former addiction. He didn't look at them with hatred, but with the detached gaze of a man who had mastered a dangerous tool. He knew the world he was returning to was still noisy, but the fear was gone. He picked up his grandfather's note, tracing the ink. He finally understood that the secret frequency wasn't a place, it was a posture. He was ready to walk back into the city's roar. The tires hummed against the asphalt, a rhythmic vibration that signaled Elias's return to the steel and glass labyrinth of the city. As the skyline appeared on the horizon, glowing with the artificial heat of millions of screens, he felt the familiar pull of the old world. But the man who gripped the steering wheel was not the man who had fled weeks ago. His hands were steady, his breathing was deep and intentional. The noise of the traffic, the aggressive honking of horns, and the blinding flashes of digital billboards were no longer external threats to his sanity. They were merely the weather of a world he was passing through. He realized now that the desert was not a destination he had left behind, but a geography he had mapped within his own soul. He carried the stillness with him, a portable sanctuary built from the verses he had chewed on until they became part of his very bone and marrow. On his first morning back, the habit of a decade tried to reassert itself. As his eyes opened, his hand instinctively reached for the nightstand, seeking the cold, glass surface of his smartphone. It was a phantom limb reflex, the muscle memory of a digital addict. But he stopped. He let his hand fall back to the sheets. Word first, world second. This was the new architecture of his day. Before he allowed the voices of 1,000 strangers and the demands of his inbox to enter his mind, he chose to fill it with the ancient. He sat in the grey light of dawn, not scrolling, but ruminating. He whispered a single psalm, turning the words over in his mouth like a slow-burning ember. Haggah. The low mutter of the word created a barrier that the frantic energy of the coming day could not penetrate. He realized that focus was not something he had to find. It was something he had to protect. When Elias entered his high-pressure workplace, the change was palpable to everyone who encountered him. The office was a hive of fragmented attention, a place where people boasted of multitasking while their eyes remained glassy and unfocused. His desk was piled with the backlog of his absence, and his computer screen flickered with hundreds of unread notifications. In the past, this sight would have triggered a cascade of cortisol, a tightening in his chest that led to a day of shallow, panicked work. Now, He approached the chaos with a surgical precision. He did not react. He responded. He closed his email tab and focused on one task at a time, his mind anchored by the internal rhythm of the scriptures he had memorized. He was more effective in 3 hours of focused labor than he had been in 12 hours of distracted busyness. His peers watched in confusion as he navigated the storm with a quiet authority, no longer a victim of the urgent, but a steward of the important. The resolution of his professional standing came not through desperate striving, but through this newfound clarity. When confronted with the missed deadlines of his past self, Elias offered no excuses. He spoke with a directness and honesty that disarmed his critics. He settled the matters with Julian, the colleague he had wronged, with a public humility that shifted the entire atmosphere of the department. People began to seek him out, not just for his skills, but for the strange, magnetic peace he radiated. They asked him how he stayed so calm in the midst of the quarterly crunch, and Elias would smile, his mind briefly touching the memory of the desert sun. He realized that focus was his greatest act of worship. By giving his full attention to the person in front of him or the task at hand, he was honoring the creator of time itself. He understood that to be focused was to be faithful, and to be present was to be like the one who had called him into the light. The true victory, however, was not found in his productivity, but in his presence. As the sun set over the city, casting a copper glow against the skyscrapers, Elias walked into the heart of a crowded subway station. The air was thick with heat, the scent of rain on pavement, and the frantic energy of thousands of people rushing home. In the middle of the platform, surrounded by the blur of commuters staring into their glowing palms, Elias stood still. He did not feel the need to reach for his pocket to escape the moment. He was fully there, grounded in a reality that transcended the digital noise. He closed his eyes for a second, whispering a fragment of a promise under his breath, a soft sound lost to the roar of the incoming train. The desert was no longer a place of isolation. It was the silent center of his hurricane. He had reclaimed his focus, and in doing so, he had reclaimed his life. The war for his attention was over, and the word had won. He stood in the crowd, a living testimony that peace was not found in the absence of noise, but in the presence of the truth. The desert was now inside him, and he would never be lost again.